encounters us, and it appears to be screaming in anguish. Edvard Munch's The Scream, one of the most famous images in the history of art, has become for us a universal symbol of angst and anxiety. Europe was at the birth of the modern era when he painted The Scream, and the image reflects the intense anxieties that troubled the world at this time. Anxieties which Edvard Munch himself found overwhelming. The figure is in fact not screaming at all. Rather, it is holding its hands over its ears to block out the scream. Between 1863, when Munch was born, and the years before the First World War, European cities were going through truly exceptional changes. Industrialization and economic shifts brought fear, obsessions, diseases, political unrest, and radicalism. Questions were being raised about society and the changing role of man within it, about our psyche, our social responsibilities, and most radical of all, about the existence of God. The rich were getting richer, but in Christiania, now Oslo, living and working conditions were as bad as ever, a major cause of death and disease. Munch himself would endure a life ravaged by madness, sickness, and death. His mother and his sister both died of tuberculosis. His father and grandfather suffered from depression, and another sister, Laura, from schizophrenia. His only brother would later die of pneumonia. Always a sickly child himself, Munch turned to drawing to keep himself occupied in his sickbed. When he later decided to become an artist, his father, a fundamental Christian, gave him no support, as he considered the profession unholy. He told his son that the death of his mother and sister was divine punishment for their sins, and his traumatic childhood never left him as an adult. This would have a lasting effect on Munch's work. His early paintings were grounded in realism, but in 1884 he joined Christiania's Bohemian Circle, which was led by the anarchist writer Hans Jaeger. Jaeger encouraged Munch to reject religion, break with bourgeois principles and morals, and move away from realism to paint his own emotional and psychological state. A powerful painting dating from this period drew on the death of his sister and mother. It is hard now to imagine the outrage it caused, but the bourgeois Norwegians despised the rough brushstrokes, scratched surface, and the deep melancholy of the piece. The painting and the ensuing scandal would set the tone for his future work. Munch was looking outside of provincial Christiania, and on a short trip to Paris in 1885, he had the chance to see the revolutionary work of the Impressionists. Their use of colour and form was a revelation for the young artist. Munch was always loath to admit that he was influenced by any artists, but here we can compare Monet's solitary figure lost in thought with Munch's own later composition. Whereas Monet's paintings are a study of light on the exterior, Munch is exploring the interior life and already shows a preoccupation with loneliness and angst. The years in Paris were his experimental years, when Munch was finding his style, and in 1889 he returned to Paris to study for 3 years. The Eiffel Tower had just been completed, the post-impressionists were becoming established, and Vincent van Gogh had just painted The Starry Night. Van Gogh's expressive and emotional brushwork deeply influenced Munch, as did his use of colour. Munch understood that Van Gogh's posthumous fame was thanks to a combination of
Mr. Tin. Tin or Ten? Mr. Ten.
And later,
I don't know how to read
was not averse
your
to
name.
marketing
Good job,
himself
thank you.
as a mad genius, which he understood would play an important role in his art. Mostly he was fascinated by Paul Gauguin and his symbols, whose ideas he would expand on. Gauguin's use of heavy outlines, simplified shapes, and solid blocks of colour would influence Munch's style. He would later adopt the bold graphic outlines of Gauguin, Van Gogh, and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, whose posters were on the streets of Paris when Munch arrived. The young artist was like a sponge, soaking up painting styles, ideas and motifs from different artists, sometimes in a more obvious way. And like most artists of this period, he experimented with pointillism. What really interested him about the post-impressionists was their rejection of realism in favour of absolute truth through their own emotional experience and imagination. The unique thing about Munch was how he would take these formal tools and ideas from French painting and then combine them with a northern sensibility, more concerned with melancholy. In 1892, he was invited to Berlin, where these psychological insights would not be welcomed. Munch was invited to put on a solo show in Berlin, but the organisers had no first-hand experience of his work. Norwegian paintings of fjords were very fashionable, and they were expecting this. The Germans thought his work was too raw, too brutal, and too unfinished. The show was so controversial that it would be shut down after a week. Munch, however, was delighted with the scandal, as his notoriety ensured he became an overnight sensation in Germany. In Berlin, he was friends with the Swedish writer
Mr.
Edvard.
Teen, I
And as so
also
often with Munch,
like
it was
to
literature
art
he looked
like
to for
you.
inspiration to explain universal human experiences. We can see his work in this period as moving away from painting one image and more towards series of works that can be viewed in literary terms. The masterful series he produced in the 1890s, Ways of Life, was intended to be seen as a poem of life, love and death, and it would be his life's major work. The series started with 6, which eventually grew to a total of 22 works. The Scream would be just one of them. The Impressionists had of course worked in series, but more as an observation on light and atmospheric conditions, whereas Munch was working this way to create a total work of art, or in German, a Gesamtkunstwerk. Munch split the works into 4 themes, and when we place them together, as he would have, we can see he was trying to tell a story. Here we have the seeds of love, the passing of love,
Mr. Teen, how long did it take you to draw that
and
picture? No, I lost track of the exact hours I spent on this drawing, but this is a quicker portrait because I use a very nice pencil for quick drawings, which is Cretacolor Nero.
To avoid breaking up the group. The more popular the painting, the more copies there are in existence. On top of this, he had a pathological hatred of parting with his paintings, which he called My Children, as if he couldn't better part with his past. On the 22nd of January 1892, Munch wrote in his diary, "I was walking down the road with 2 friends when the sun set. Suddenly the sky turned as red as blood. My friends walked on. I stood quaking with angst, and I felt as though a vast endless scream passed through nature." What is debatable is whether those screams were real or psychological. The idea of the figure in the landscape and man's relationship to nature is something that Munch draws on from the romantic tradition of the early 19th century. But the Scream focuses on the inner psychology of man, relation to nature. A painting he did just a year before the Scream is a rather similar image, but with a small crowd of ghostly figures staring out at us. The painting conveys urban alienation, the feeling that you can be all alone in a crowd. And Munch's figure in the Scream expresses similar ideas about anxiety and alienation. The disturbing figures are a reoccurring theme for Munch, and he used the same setting to produce other paintings. This painting also has the same red-yellow sky, mountains and fjords in the background, but instead of the skeletal figure staring out at us, there is a self-portrait of Munch. The composition itself is simple. We can divide the painting into the bridge, the fjords and the sky. The main figure is curved and broadens out to blend into the background. The 2 figures, his friends in the diary entry, are vertical, unlike the main figure. This, with the sharp diagonals of the bridge, anchor us in the real world. The background suggests the world is dissolving into chaos and prefigures abstract painting. The tiny figures are deep in conversation, and despite the chaos, they are oblivious. Munch underlines their emotional distance from the protagonist by placing them at a physical distance, walking away on an absolutely straight road. The painting may look as if it is done quickly, but Munch would go through meticulous preparation. Here we see the development of the lone figure, as it goes from the far distance to the foreground. In his diary sketch, the violent red sky develops, and written to the side is his description of that walk with his friends. The self-portrait will give way to the figure we know. Note, in this sketch, one of the two background figures is not yet walking away. If we take the two figures away completely, the scene is not as claustrophobic, and it changes the atmosphere. Every element in the painting is carefully planned. And even after all this planning, Munch made last-minute changes, as we see with this initial sketch on the reverse. This 1893 painting is probably his first version of the screen. It is mixed media, oil, tempera and pastel. This one, also dated 1893, is in pastel.
$7 million. How much?
The only one in private hands. And this is a later copy from 1910, also tempera. All the paintings are done on unprimed cardboard. Munch often worked with cheap material, first because he couldn't afford canvas, and later because the texture suited his aesthetic. They were often glued onto wooden boards, as we can see here, a treatment no longer used. He would use diluted paint, a technique he picked up from Toulouse-Lautrec, and he deliberately left paintings unfinished as a sort of anti-art statement. He wanted the cardboard to show with various diluted layers of pastels to allow the process to show. At times, he has violently stabbed on paint with the back of his brush. He never varnished his work, as he liked the matte finish, insisting varnish killed a painting dead. Then he had something which he called the horse cure. This was basically leaving his paintings outside in the garden in all weathers, to fend for themselves. He thought his paintings should have an organic life, and he wanted them to look aged. Here we can see one of the many stains on the painting.
Dilnoza by Matova. Beautiful. Thank you, thank you. Julie Hadinera, hello. Wow, ang ganda na. Salamat.
Three armed masked men burst into the Munch Museum in Oslo. Its visitors watched.
One of the ironies about the screen is that when it was recovered after being stolen, it was quickly jumped upon by a small army of conservators. Munch, however, would have preferred they left it damaged as part of its ongoing life. I think it is interesting to look at possible inspiration. Scientists have linked the sky's unnatural colours to volcanic dust from the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which generated incredible sunsets in Europe for months after. They have also linked it to a phenomenon known as nacreous cloud formations, common in Norway during winter, which is when Munch painted the screen. A possible inspiration for the figure is this Peruvian mummy, which Munch certainly saw on display at the Paris World's Fair of 1889. The figure itself is featureless, ungendered and de-individualized, and perhaps one of the reasons why, despite being a painting, it has become a universal symbol of anxiety. It is a blank page into which you can project yourself, and so it becomes about what we, the viewer, bring to it. The figure is looking right at us, which pins us down, locking us into the angst-ridden scene. Barely visible on the painting is a pencil inscription stating, "Could only have been painted by a madman." Infrared images show that it was Munch's handwriting and that it was written after the painting was first exhibited in 1895. Several important critics have questioned Munch's mental health, and it deeply hurt the artist, who had a morbid fear of insanity. We can look at the later added inscription as an angry, ironic comment from Munch. Then there is another inscription by Munch on an earlier lithograph. "I felt a huge scream through nature." confirming that the figure is not screaming at all.
Whiskey Hunter
Nature
looks
around
great.
him is.
Thank you so
What
much.
is interesting is why Munch was in that location in the first place. The setting of the screen came about after the artist took a scenic walk. As described in his diary, the actual place is called Edvard, which overlooks Oslo Ford, with a view towards the setting sun during the winter months. But as so often with Munch, his strength is how he departs from reality. He was not here for the scenery, but to visit his younger sister Laura, who had recently been confined to an asylum near this spot. Munch's father had just died, and after a lifetime of abandonment through death and disease, it is not too difficult to imagine the distress that he must have experienced as he left his beloved sister behind. Her screams of terror must have haunted him as he walked away. In a world of extreme and rapid change, combined with a life of desperate anxiety and alienation, Munch, who would have a nervous breakdown in 1908, must have felt overwhelmed, as if his life was unraveling. All of us, in some way, understand the desperate feeling Munch must have had of wanting to block out all of this noise. By the mid-17th century, the age of flamboyant Baroque was in full swing. It was an art movement that came from conflict. Europe had experienced the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the wars of religion and inquisitions. The art being produced in Catholic countries had become a powerful tool of propaganda, characterized by a heightened sense of drama, movement and theatricality that had never been seen before. But in the Netherlands, a new wave of realism was sweeping across the country. Johannes Vermeer was producing simple domestic interiors of middle-class life. His paintings were quiet, private and unassuming. Secular works that contained stories of real human relationships. Vermeer's art would be totally forgotten about right up until the mid-19th century, the age of the camera. His incredible mastery of hyperrealism would lead some people to question the authenticity of Vermeer, to question whether he used mechanical means to achieve such perfect illusions. For some people, as we shall see, Johannes Vermeer is considered a cheat.
Julie Hardinera, wala akong magawang portrait ngayon. Natuwa ako dahil yung ginawa kong dalawang portraits ay binayaran ako. Bilang pasasalamat at pagtitiwala nila sa akin kahit hindi naman ako professional artist. Wow, that's nice. That's nice to hear.
Two dramatically different cultures. The northern territories were Protestant, the southern Catholic. The 80 Years' War ended in independence for the north in 1648. While the southern Netherlands remained Catholic and a part of Spain, in the north, the strict Protestant sect of Calvinism became the nation's official religion. Religious imagery was banned, and an emphasis was placed on simplicity in both worship and decorative style. A sharp break with the old monarchist and Catholic cultural traditions would mean that Dutch art had to reinvent itself almost entirely. We know Vermeer was born in Delft in 1632. Then next to nothing is known about him until he marries Catharina Bolnes in 1653. She was Catholic, and Vermeer almost certainly converted to Catholicism secretly before they married, probably at the insistence of his wealthy mother-in-law, who at first opposed the marriage. Although Catholic Mass was banned, freedom of religion in the Dutch Republic was official, and converting to Catholicism didn't bring Vermeer any personal or professional disadvantages. The couple moved in with Catharina's mother, and Vermeer spent the rest of his life in the same town, the same house, slowly producing paintings in the same room on the second floor, at a rate of 2 or 3 a year. It is thought Vermeer produced 60 or so paintings, of which only 36 survive today. Vermeer and Katerina had 15 children, of which 11 survived. We know at least 5 other adults lived in the same house, as well as Vermeer's own 11 children. And yet, he never shows us any suggestion of family, or the chaos that naturally comes with a household that big. It is safe to say that the peace and quiet Vermeer depicts in these paintings was not what he experienced in real life. Maybe that is the point. Genre paintings were scenes of everyday life, ordinary people engaged in common activities that both reflected and helped define ideals about the family, love, morals, courtship and duty. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic dominated global trade and was the wealthiest country in the world. But the Dutch Calvinists were a frugal and austere group, naturally inhibited and embarrassed by wealth. Hugely popular, and no longer the preserve of the church or aristocracy, or even the very wealthy. Paintings could be found in shops, taverns and houses. It was a boom time for artists. Along with paintings, maps started to appear in homes, appealing to the Dutch desire for order. Cityscapes were an emblem of self-determination and a sense of pride in the young Dutch Republic. While Dutch Calvinists denounced devotional artwork in churches, they explicitly encouraged devotees to turn their attention to the visible world around them. One of the most successful subcategories of genre painting was the kitchen scene. The Dutch saw hard work as spiritual and household economy as a holy virtue, moderation in all things. There were so many Dutch artists producing genre paintings, but if we look at these two paintings on the same theme, we see there were none quite like Vermeer, whose quiet settings, serene lighting, cropping and ambiguousness made his scenes more universal than most genre paintings. Artists borrowed themes and compositions from each other readily. There was no shame in copying. Once a theme took off in sales, artists would produce their own variations. Vermeer's paintings are all small, but the Milkmaid is very small. It is oil on canvas. According to conservators, it took 2 months to paint. The first thing to note is that she is not a milkmaid, but a domestic kitchen maid. She is a young woman of a strong build, wearing a crisp linen cap, a blue apron and work sleeves pushed up from thick forearms. The unassuming maid is poised between action and introspection. She is slowly pouring milk into a squat earthenware vessel commonly known as a Dutch oven. Her concentration and careful pouring suggest she is following a precise recipe. The Dutch oven has a deep rim, so a lid can be put on top for cooking. In front of the pot are broken pieces of stale bread. It is thought she is making some kind of bread pudding. Her transformation of stale, unusable bread into something edible and her careful use of ingredients would have been picked up by the 17th century Dutch as an illustration of domestic virtue, a greatly admired value. We don't know who the model is, but Vermeer couldn't afford to pay models, so used his family and servants. It could be Tanneke Everpol, a maid in Vermeer's house, but if it is not meant to be a portrait. Vermeer is really showing his astounding ability to suggest a vast range of textures. The rough, inexpensive material is a sharp contrast to his later paintings of middle-class women. After the Milkmaid, Vermeer never again painted a working-class theme. The maid is wearing a starched cap. He has painted wet on wet here, as well as on other areas such as her sleeves. Then he adds texture with layers of thick paint or impasto. The arm is a masterclass in wet on wet technique. The rolled up sleeves revealing a perfectly rendered tan line. The edges of her forearms are soft, suggesting movement. We can feel the tension she has to maintain to let the milk pour out so slowly. And we can also sense
Julie Hedinera, anong gamit mong pencil? Cretacolor Nero.
it really is
Matte
as if
crease,
her arms
I always find drawing a female face more difficult than a male face. I think it is because of the lack of facial
covered in my
lines.
video, Great Art
Ooh,
Cities
that's...
London. The maid is wearing a yellow chamois leather top. painted with lead tin yellow, the brightest yellow pigment available in Vermeer's time, and one
Facial lines, meaning
he would use the same yellow pigment in later representations
you have more
of the famous fur-trimmed
like
wool
gauge
jackets adorned by elegant women.
rather than
The
just
rough reddish stitching
smooth
is not meant to be
things.
famous and tells us it is a purely practical garment. She wears a heavy blue apron over a red wool skirt, which suggests that the picture was painted in winter. In Vermeer's day, there were a limited number of pigments, and he only used about 20 of them. But along with lead tin yellow, he did use expensive ultramarine a lot. It was made from crushed lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone imported from present-day Afghanistan. We know Vermeer struggled financially most of his life, and we think it was his patron, Pieter van Hoekven, who supplied the artist with such costly pigment. The strange green sleeves are called moorsmorven, or mess sleeves. They are not part of the yellow bodice, but are worn separately to protect against staining. We can see them in other works. Rather than underdrawing, Vermeer used a monochromatic layer, where he would identify tone, lighting, and composition. He uses different blocks of colour for different areas of the painting, which adds to the luminosity. Vermeer famously uses a sort of pointillism in the bread and basket, which suggests light as it flickers off the broken surface of the stale bread. He uses dabs of ochre to show us the rough edges of the dry bread, giving us a texture which suggests staleness. We first see his use of pointillé in this painting, and the technique appears in about half of Vermeer's works. The entire still life on the table is a masterpiece that uses a combination of thin glazes, impasto, colour, and a perfect depiction of light refraction on every single crumb. Unusually for the time, Vermeer uses impressionistic dabs of blue here, which act as reflective highlights and intensifies the brick colour of the stoneware. Kitchen maids were often portrayed in Dutch paintings and literature as discrete objects of desire and sexually threatening to the home. Vermeer possibly acknowledged the tradition of the maid as a sexual being by placing one of the Delft tiles behind her depicting Cupid. It is thought that she is in a cold kitchen because here we can see a foot warmer. These were wooden perforated boxes with hot coals inside. There is a possibility Vermeer was using the foot warmer symbolically, as in popular literature they were often associated with the heat of sex. More likely, he is referring to her inner warmth. The 17th century male viewer would have noticed the contrast of the rough leather sleeves with the fleshy nudity of her exposed forearm, which they would have found titillating. While we can't dismiss this erotic subtext, I do believe that Vermeer, though not from the servant class, did marry above his station and treats the subject of a lower class woman with dignity and empathy. Vermeer's focus is on the maid as an ideal woman, a paragon of homely virtue. She might be seen, even today, as the essence of the Dutch character, strong, simple and direct. The painting is built up along two diagonal lines that draw our attention to the pouring milk, the focal point for both us and the maid. On the wall are a frame, a bread basket and a pail. They each retain their own distinct form and texture, but they also cascade down towards the stream of milk. The painting is from a low angle, which gives her monumentality. Vermeer uses the classic pyramid shape as stability, which I have discussed before. He not only used the same props again and again in his paintings, but he also recycled the same poses. This is a pose we have seen before in this painting, but although the upper-class woman is surrounded by expensive furnishings and the kitchen maid has nothing but her clothes, both women command our respect. This X-ray shows us that originally Vermeer had an overflowing clothes basket here, but painted over it. He also had a map on the wall behind the maid. By taking these away and leaving the whitewashed wall, it not only isolates the figures, but also reflects light and cleanliness. If we look again at this painting, we can see there are dirty dishes waiting to be cleaned, suggesting the servant is lazy and disorganized. If Vermeer had left the full laundry basket, he would be telling a different story, and by removing this and the map, he creates an uncluttered backdrop, both physically and psychologically. Vermeer often placed a chair or table or curtain in the foreground of his paintings to create a theatrical barrier and reinforce the sense of privacy between the figures and the viewer. It also adds depth and three-dimensionality. We can see the type of window if we look at this painting Vermeer created of his aunt's house. Windows in the 17th century had small, uneven panes. Top left lighting is an artistic convention that goes back to ancient Rome. And as we've seen, the windows in Vermeer's works are almost always to the left. In this painting, he shows them as full of imperfections, and they are not clear, leading to a more diffused, softer light. My favourite detail is this cracked pane, which lets in a little beam of unfiltered light. Light is of course what Vermeer is famous for, and the flow of light from left to right and its intensity activates the canvas. The light gradually and perfectly diminishes as it flows from light to dark. And every nail, hole, crack and crevice is treated with the same attention to detail as the pouring milk. Vermeer takes a white wall and elevates it to a picture within a picture, a stage setting for the artist's quiet little drama. The amount of work Vermeer produced was pretty meagre, and when he died his work was owned by just one or two collectors in the small town of Delft. The lack of exposure ensured that his name just disappears from art history completely until 1866, when a French art critic wrote about him. Photography was just becoming popular at this time, and people couldn't help but connect Vermeer's hyper-realistic work with the new technology. Almost immediately, the suggestion arose that Vermeer used a camera obscura, the forerunner of the modern photographic camera, as a way of copying. A darkened room has a pinhole on one side, and through this hole an inverted image is projected via a lens into a darkened space, onto a canvas inside. Now the question is, did Vermeer use one to create his work? The pro-camera argument is the lack of underdrawings in his work, the perfect perspective, and the portrayal of objects out of focus. Like every theory, there are endless variations. The artist David Hockney famously made his case on the matter, and in the 2013 film, Tim's Vermeer, they claimed to reproduce a Vermeer. You can find links to these and counter theories in my video description. As we know, plenty of great artists didn't rely on underdrawing. And if Vermeer did rely on a camera obscura to trace an image, then there would be an underdrawing. The strongest argument for his use of mechanical help is his extremely accurate perspective. Along with the hyperrealism, people asked, how is this possible? Recent evidence shows that he used a more rudimentary method to obtain accurate perspective. So far, pinpricks have been found in 13 Vermeer paintings, including the Milkmaid just above her right hand. In fact, it is visible to the naked eye, as we can see. A string with chalk on it was attached to the pin, which the painter would have snapped to get perspective lines, a common method among Dutch artists. My question is, why would Vermeer use this method to work out perspective if he was simply tracing the image with a camera obscura? Of course, there is a possibility he used optical aids of some kind, but I'm not convinced, and there is no solid evidence. To be frank, I don't think it's that important. If it is true, it is just one process of making a painting, and doesn't detract from Vermeer's unique genius. The introduction of quiet everyday scenes of life unfolding in private households was among the most striking innovations of the Dutch Golden Age. Vermeer infused his scenes of daily life with layer upon layer of meaning. We come out with more questions than answers, and that's exciting. There is an intriguing mystery about the Milkmaid that keeps us coming back. In 1672, France invaded the Netherlands, and Vermeer fell victim to the disastrous economic climate that followed. The art market collapsed overnight, and he would die just 3 years later, leaving behind a wife, 11 children, and enormous debts. His large family had to sell everything just to survive. We can't really say Vermeer was forgotten, as he was never really known. Perhaps it is the quiet, unassuming nature of Vermeer's work that means it took hundreds of years for him to even get noticed. Perhaps the world came to realize that the quiet moments are often the most profound. It is a myth that Vincent van Gogh was ill his entire adult life. As far as we know, he didn't have his first major episode until Christmas of 1888, when he was 35, and 2 years later, he was dead, so just the last couple of years. He did, however, spend 11 of the last 18 months in an asylum, and his illness would eventually claim his life, shortly after his 37th birthday. The artist understood that madness was an illness like any other, and that between episodes he wasn't mad. It was through his work he would recover and stay well longer. But there is no doubt that Van Gogh's mental health colours how we look at his work, and that includes his last painting. There was always debate about which painting was the artist's last. For many years it was thought to be this painting, mainly because it featured in the 1930s book and the 1956 film adaptation of that book, and the painting's dark and gloomy subject matter
But Chris
seems to perfectly
looks
encapsulate
finished.
the last days
No,
of Van
no,
Gogh,
not yet.
full of foreboding of his eventual death. But now it is widely accepted that this unusual
The skin tone is done. It's finished,
mystery
but
of what it was
there are
and where it
some
was
parts
painted
that
will take over a century
remain
to solve.
unfinished, like this
That
cloth
was only thanks to a worldwide
in
epidemic.
on her
What it
head.
means is that now we have a deeper insight into what Van Gogh's final hours were like before his tragic death. In May 1890, Vincent checked himself out of the Saint-Remy asylum and headed to Paris to see his beloved brother Theo, his sister-in-law Jo, and their new baby, Vincent, who they had named after him. He created this picture to celebrate the birth. In the asylum, he had worked every day except during his 4 mental breakdowns, when he made several attempts to take his own life. As I explain in my earlier Van Gogh film, he still managed to complete an incredible 150 paintings there, about one painting every other day. In the end, he spent only 3 days in Paris with Theo and his family, as he found the city overwhelming. The restless artist, who had already moved 36 times in his lifetime, was on the move again. This time to Auvers-sur-Oise, about an hour's train ride from Paris. Theo, Vincent's champion, had completely supported his brother financially since 1882, but paint was expensive, and Vincent often used up his allowance buying supplies rather than food, endangering his health. The arrival of the new baby meant that Theo, whose finances were already stretched, had even more financial responsibilities. Along with problems at work, it is no surprise he was less than sympathetic with Vincent and his problems. So by the time the artist left to go back to Auvers, he was convinced he was a financial and emotional drain on Theo, and it was a huge worry to him as he moved to his new house. By the time Vincent moved to Auvers, it was already famous as an artistic hub. Paul Cézanne, Camille Pissarro, Auguste Renoir, and Charles-François d'Aubigne had all painted the region, but it would take Van Gogh to immortalize it. The artists were all friends or patients of Dr. Paul Ferdinand Gachet, a doctor, an amateur painter, and an art collector, who also knew Claude Monet and Victor Hugo. Theo had set up an introduction for Vincent so that Dr. Gachet could keep an eye on his health, and the doctor would accept paintings by the artist in lieu of payments for treatments. On May the 20th, 1890, the artist moved into the Auberge Graveau Inn for 3 francs 50 cents per day for bed and board. He had room number 5, a simple attic room of 7 square meters, where he would spend his last 70 days. He also had a painting studio he shared with other resident artists. Dr. Gachet recommended that Van Gogh work as much as possible to prevent his illness from taking over, and it was his work and his prodigious output, often seen as a descent into madness, that in fact drove him to keep going. Auvert saw was energized Van Gogh, who saw something to paint everywhere he looked, and he set out to capture the warmth and security of rural life, and did so with vibrant colours, in which green often dominated. Vincent, even more frenzied than before, would produce 75 works and over 100 sketches in his last 70 days. He worked so fast that he sometimes ran out of canvas and painted on tea towels. We can clearly see the red checked cloth coming through here. Dr. Gachet and Vincent became close immediately. The artist would describe him as a ready-made friend and something like a new brother in a letter. Gachet, who would care deeply for the troubled artist, would be a pivotal man in this story, as well as in the later dissemination of Van Gogh's legacy. After another visit to Theo and his family in Paris on July the 6th, Vincent learned that his brother was thinking of quitting his job at the art dealers he had managed over many years. Theo was also starting to show signs of the syphilis that would kill him 6 months after Vincent. On his return to Auvers, the artist's behaviour darkened. His anxiety began to overwhelm him, and he stopped socialising with Dr. Gachet's family after some petty arguments, and began to spend more and more time alone, sinking into dark thoughts and drinking excessively. No doubt his brother's health and financial affairs began to play on his mind. Vincent signed his paintings with his first name, mainly because he knew his surname was difficult to pronounce, and he rarely dated his paintings, but we can date his works by reading his letters, of which he is estimated to have written over 2,000, of which 903 survive, which are all dated. In them, he often described what he was working on, or did sketches of paintings he was creating, even writing the colours on the sketches. Thanks to these letters, we can accurately work out the date of individual undated paintings. And thanks to one of those letters, we even know the colours he had on his palette. In the final weeks of his life, Vincent worked on a series of landscapes on the hills above Auvers. The paintings are unusual in that they are 50 centimetres high and a metre wide, an entirely new format of canvas that he had not used before. He painted no fewer than 12 of them, including wheat fields with crows and tree roots. On the 10th of July, Vincent, feeling dreadfully alone in Auvers, wrote to Theo that he wanted to express extreme solitude and sadness in these wheat field paintings, and they are dreadfully poignant. He had painted many portraits in Auvers and saw portraiture as representing his best work. But these last works were vast expanses, totally devoid of any human figures, not even farm workers he had previously dotted his landscapes with. It is as if he has given up on humanity. In the same letter to Theo of July the 10th, he wrote, "My life too is attacked to the very root," and a painting which a friend described as an underwood full of sun and life the day after Vincent's death is now considered by scholars to be his very last painting. It is a strange work. It too is devoid of people, but it is also devoid of form. It is unfinished, which is extremely unusual for Van Gogh, and a sign it was still being worked on when he died. Due to its experimental nature and abstract quality, experts were puzzled as to whether the location of the painting even existed outside of Vincent's head, and it would take over a century to find an answer. Wouter van der Veen the scientific director of the Van Gogh Institute, was lent a collection of antique postcards, which he never had time to look through until lockdown, when we all had more time on our hands. He just happened to have one of the old postcards on his computer screen at home in France when something clicked in his mind. The postcard, which dated to 1900, reminded him of Van Gogh's tree roots. He pulled up a digital version of the painting and compared them side by side and realized it was the same place. We now know the tree roots was painted on the Rue d'Aubigny, a main road through Auvers-sur-Oise, about 4 minutes walk from the inn that Vincent lived in, thanks to this bizarre coincidence. The slope with the exposed tree roots is in a coppice or thicket where the wood was used for firewood. But miraculously, inspecting the site, they found that the tree stumps were still more or less intact, and we can now view the very site where Vincent van Gogh painted his last work on his last day. As I show in my video on Starry Night, Vincent didn't reproduce nature scenes exactly, but painted what he thought worked better aesthetically, and Tree Roots is no exception. It's an unusual painting, tightly cropped, which brings to mind the Japanese works he so admired, with no real sense of space or perspective, almost abstract in its composition, with several parts left unfinished, as if he just suddenly stopped, maybe with the intention to finish it in the studio back at the inn. We see the short, sharp brushstrokes we are familiar with, and the work is painted with Van Gogh's usual sense of urgency. It is now thought he started the painting on the morning of the 27th of July on Rue d'Aubigny and worked on until late afternoon. The sunlight direction on the painting suggests that the last brushstrokes were painted towards the end of the afternoon as the sun was beginning to set. It is thought that Vincent then took the painting back to the inn, unfinished, and left with a revolver to take his own life. As he said in a previous letter, "I have lived just like those tree roots. I've done my best. I've struggled with life." He then went to the outskirts of the village to a peaceful wheat field as the sun was setting, possibly one he had already painted, and shot himself, staggered back to Dr. Gachet's house sometime after supper, and died 2 days later on July the 29th, 1890. 8 years before, Van Gogh had painted this image of tree roots, of which he wrote to Theo, "I wanted to express something of life's struggle in those gnarled black roots with their knots." And it is tempting to see his final painting, Tree Roots, as a similar life struggle, with its tangled and exposed broken roots
Varsha
and jagged
Parkale.
brushstrokes reflecting
Wow,
his
thank you.
disturbed mind. The unfinished canvas as a sign of frustration and despair with a difficult work. Theo was told the morning after the incident and immediately made his way to Auvers, in time to see his brother alive for the last time. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, Vincent looked at Theo, his closest supporter, his brother, and his protector, and said, "I would like to be able to leave like this." And that is what he did, on his own terms. Since 1890, Vincent van Gogh's death was seen as self-inflicted. Then in 2011, a biography was published that stated that Vincent did not take his own life, but was killed by 2 local boys. It is a theory that is now dismissed by most historians, but conspiracy theories have a habit of catching on. 2 films and numerous press articles have presented this theory. Why is this? Van Gogh has come to be epitomized as the artist wronged by society, and as such, it is easier to place blame on others. But the simplest answer is often the correct one. That Vincent, whose letters show that he was anything but optimistic about the future, had enough of suffering. Vincent said so to his brother, and he said so to Dr. Gachet, a man who knew gunshots. When Vincent's clothes were being sorted out the day he shot himself, the draft of a letter to Theo that he never sent was found in his pocket, stained with his own blood. We will never know if he kept it on him deliberately but in it he wrote about what was troubling him on that day, saying he was writing in a state of crisis and was worried about being a burden on Theo, complaining that work by dead artists sells better than living ones, and ending with, "I risked my life for my own work." Like his last painting, the letter was unfinished. Dr. Gachet sketched this portrait of Vincent on his deathbed, which shows the artist mutilated here. The funeral was arranged to take place in the church at Auvers, which Vincent had immortalized in an earlier painting. But taking one's own life was still considered a sin by the Catholic Church, and the request was refused. So instead, the funeral took place at the next village. It is another myth that only a handful of people came, and it was very well attended, with friends, artists and locals. Vincent's body was laid out in the room that he used as a studio, surrounded by his last canvases and masses of yellow flowers, including, of course, his beloved sunflowers. The route of the funeral cortege took them past the church that had denied Vincent a Christian burial, and he was laid to rest in what Theo described as a sunny spot among the wheat fields. Then in October 1890, just 3 weeks after the death of Van Gogh, Theo, with advanced syphilis, lost his mind and was confined to an asylum, where he too would eventually die on the 25th of January 1891 and be buried in the Netherlands. Then in 1905, the lease on Vincent's original grave in Auvers ran out, and he needed to be reburied. Theo's widow, Jo, decided to move her husband's remains from Utrecht to France, and to unite the two brothers together again for an eternity.